under current circumstances as a budget macro stabilization in normal times. But in big and unusual crises, having a common insurance mechanism which can be activated in this particular crisis situation is extremely valuable. This is what insurance is about, not fixing small problems, but helping us and protecting us when we have a big problem. Third point, this doesn't mean the availability of European insurance doesn't mean the member states can relax in their efforts. We also need them to build up fiscal buffers for future crises, which means many of them need to reduce their debt ratios. One way of doing so is investing more, growing more, using the funds of NextGenEU wisely. Inevitably, the next crisis will come. One of the messages, as I understand it, of NextGenEU and this budget is that we need to work towards more resilience. And that means regarding future crises, we simply want to be prepared. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Fürst. Over the past few hours, we've been talking about the many ways in which the budget has contributed to tackle some of the challenges that the EU is facing. But we also have been reflecting on how it has evolved to tackle challenges. We have seen it with the COVID-19 crisis. We are seeing it with climate action, with the digital transformation. So this is what we're talking about in this last panel session of the EU conference, the evolving nature of the EU budget. And for that, I'm going to welcome our speakers and moderator.
Well, thanks very much indeed for the introduction. My name is Sam Fleming. I'm the Brussels Bureau Chief of the Financial Times. Enormous pleasure and privilege to be here to moderate this discussion with Commissioner Hahn. We're talking about the evolving nature of the EU budget and the way and the extent to which that budget will have to change and its role will have to change in the years to come. Clearly, we're at a period of multiple, been hearing all day really, a period of multiple challenges facing the EU budgetary scene. COVID-19 forced massive expansion in terms of fiscal support measures. It comes at a time of rising aging populations and pressure on long-term budgetary pressure because of that. And on top of that, then we have the needs of the digital and green transitions. The Commission's own estimates suggest that public and private investments of 650 billion a year until 2030, the bulk of which will be related to the green challenge. So the EU clearly responded in July last year with NextGenEU, which is an 800 billion euro program, providing a big payment towards those challenges, but obviously that's only part of the answer. So we want to talk a bit about what needs to come next. I'm delighted to be joined by two of the policymakers who are at the heart of this debate. As on the screen, you can hopefully see Kristalina Georgieva, who's the Managing Director of the International Monetary Fund, and on stage with me, Johannes Hahn, the EU's Budget Commissioner. Both speakers are well known to everyone in the room, so I will keep my introductions very tight. Kristalina Georgieva is obviously MD since 2019, having succeeded Christine Lagarde in that role. She's a Bulgarian economist who also served commissions of Jose Manuel Barroso and also Jean-Claude Juncker as both Commissioner and Vice President. Johannes Hahn has served as EU Budget Commissioner since 2019 in the current Commission, before which he was Commissioner for the Neighbourhood and Enlargement, previously regional policy. He's a former Science and Research Minister from his native Austria. So I will start some questions amongst ourselves here on the panel and then throw it open to questions from both the audience here and online. If it's here today in the Charlemagne building, please do remember to press your button in front of you when you're asking a question. I'm going to start with Managing Director Georgieva. We've obviously, as we've been talking about, seen an enormous amount of budgetary support during the crisis. This has taken debt to GDP levels in Europe up to 100% of GDP. So my first question is, what needs to happen now? In a sense, how quickly does this support need to be pared back? And how aggressive should member states be in the European Union when it comes to trying to move to lower deficits and ultimately get the debt to GDP ratios down?
Thank you very for having me in this discussion. I would have much preferred to be with you in Brussels, but technology allows us to be still together. Let me start by congratulating Johannes Hahn and the budget team in the European Commission for incredible achievements, both by mobilizing to support the members of the European Union significantly during 2020 and now 2021, but most importantly for bringing the EU budget forward in areas that have been debated during time as a budget commissioner, and only now we see real progress. One of them is to go to markets, to use the strength of the European Union for that, and the second one, to make progress on generating revenues, own resources, as we call it on the language of the budget of the European Union. Both very important. Of course, very important also in the context of the question that you just asked. Let's step back and look at 2020. What has happened is really remarkable. We had to put the world economy in standstill and yet not to allow it to collapse. Quick and synchronized policy action, both in terms of fiscal policy support and in terms of monetary policy accommodation, have achieved exactly that. Yes, the world economy shrank by 3.1% in 2020, but it is now strongly on a path of recovery, and that shrinkage was less than initially anticipated, exactly because of the mobilization of policy support. Now in 2021, we would have hoped very much that vaccinations advancing everywhere bring more certainty on the path of recovery, and that we can talk with much more determination about the pace and the scope of withdrawing policy support. But this is not quite yet the case. We are projecting indeed strong growth in Europe this year. We are projecting strong growth next year. But we also recognize that there are remaining uncertainties, and we recognize that we are in a multi-speed recovery. The most important difference of 21 versus 2020 is that in 2020, all more or less in the same boat. In 21, we find ourselves in very different places in terms of what needs to be done to support the economy, how much space there is to continue that support. And that takes me to answering directly your question. First, we need to be extremely careful in differentiating conditions in different countries. So the definition of gradual withdrawal of policy support is done calibrated to country circumstances. There are still some with more policy space, and that allows to make further extension of policy support, and there are those where policy space is very, very limited. Second, the nature of this support has to change, and we see it already changing. No more we talk about universal putting a floor under the feet of everyone. We are talking about shifting support primarily towards viable firms and shifting the nature of this support to underpin a transformation of the economy towards climate resilience, towards digital and smart growth. And third, when we are doing that calibration of policy support, we need to look carefully at the capacity of monetary policy to be a partner. The more we can rely on extending policy accommodation in a way that complements fiscal policy gradually being withdrawn, the better off Europe, and actually for that matter, all countries in the world would be. So as we look at the next steps, I would make 3 final points. First, that we are to be much more credible in the calibration of policy support in each and every country. Look at whether there is more or less space, and then how to deploy the remaining space in a way that helps with the move of labor and capital from sectors that are shrinking, from activities that are shrinking to those that are expanding, and what are the right policy support measures, especially in terms of labor policy. Secondly, to recognize the incredible role of the Generation EU over the next years, and yes, I listened to the previous speaker, make absolute best use of it. Why? Because if it is deployed properly, it would give a push of possibly 1.5% to growth, and by doing so, reduce the risk of scarring in. And last but not least, to recognize that the lessons that are to be learned over the next months in terms of withdrawing policy support would only be strong if at the same time they complement it with medium-term fiscal consolidation plans. They anchor expectations for businesses and for consumers, for that matter, and they make that transition in a still somewhat uncertain time more viable.
Very much indeed, Manager. We are aware there are problems with the sound, which we're trying to get sorted out now. Commissioner Hahn, let me ask you about the investment side of the equation. We have, as I said in my introduction, an extraordinary amount of public and private investment which needs to be done by 2030. Next Generation EU is part of the response to that challenge, but obviously only a small, grand scheme of things, part of that response. Do you think that the European Union now has the capacity, especially in terms of public investment, the public capacity to meet this twin transition challenge of both the green and digital transition up to the end of the decade and beyond?
In one word, yes. But first and foremost, I would like to greet my friend and former colleague, Kristalina Georgieva. Thanks for joining us, and I hope indeed we can improve the connectivity. No, I think we have the capacity. We have provided the necessary financial means. Of course, like always, European money can only be understood as a kind of seed financing of something which is injecting, stimulating certain changes. And as we all agree, if I'm talking about all, means all member states, all regions, municipalities, but also stakeholders, that we have to invest very targeted in the Green Deal, in the transition, but also accompanied in a way by further investments in digitalization, which, for instance, keyword smart cities is a very intelligent combination of both. And for this, I think what is now, so to say, available is sufficient. We should not forget member states had to present their plans, their reform plans, their agenda. And of course, we also have to look into the absorption capacity. And it's not only about European money, it has also to be matched by national money, by other public sources, but in particular by the private sector. So again, what we are doing is, so to say, looking at targeted necessary investments, and for that purpose, I think we are financially well equipped. I'm nowadays more concerned about the availability of the necessary skilled labor workforce to really implement what we need to do. In particular, here I see some deficiencies or shortcomings in Europe, having in mind, so to say, our age and our structure, our demographic structure. But again, to answer the question, I think we are well equipped, and if you can see how fast the European economy is picking up in general, I'm confident, and very confident if I'm looking into the specific, country-specific reform plans, that our target of at least 37% of NextGenEU being used for climate-related investments is proposed by each member state far along the 37 minimum threshold. By the way, the same applies for digitalization, where we expect at least 20% of the overall amount to be invested in that area. So, in principle, I think Europe has understood what's at stake, and that other parts of the world are joining us.
Managing Director, obviously NextGenEU is a big innovation. One of the big question marks, which is actually being addressed across the road from us by finance ministers today, is over the broader fiscal budgetary framework operating in the European Union. This is an area which has been suspended during the crisis, but the question now is how, if at all, it should be modernized. Certainly, many economists would argue that it is more of a barrier to the kind of investment, challenging kind of investments we're talking about, and also to the tailored country-specific fiscal reductions that you were talking about as well. So could you talk a little bit about how you would like to see the Stability and Growth Pact reformed in the European Union in this process that we'll be seeing over the coming months?
I very much hope that the connection has improved. Yes? You can hear me better now?
I call it a work in progress, but we can definitely hear you enough to make out what you're saying, Managing Director.
Okay,
so please go ahead.
Excellent. Thank you. Yes, it is a moment and a great opportunity for Europe to take stock of what has been a good anchor, but overly complex, and as a result, with less attention to enforcement of the rules. So when they were suspended, that was indeed a moment to allow countries to respond to unprecedented shock, and that was the right thing to do. It also is a chance to review carefully experience and then decide on how to go forward. We heard in the previous speaker a very important word: resilience. How can we create in the European Union a budgetary framework that is more appropriate for the world we are living and will be living in, one that is fast changing and unfortunately more prone to unexpected shocks? And that argue for carefully seeking ways in which there is more simplicity, therefore one can see the enforcement as a more straightforward path, but also there is more agility that allows for circumstances that are unexpected to be accommodated in the future. We are working at the fund on our own action, on what might be options to move forward, and we will be presenting in a humble way as a contribution to discussion our views in the next months. The three principles that we believe are critical are: one, there has to be credibility coming from an anchor that is understandable. The big debate around should it be just one simple numerical or there can be some qualitative definition is an interesting debate, and let's see where it would land. Second, that it is generating a pathway to enforcement that avoids what happened this time around. Countries were growing fast. They didn't take that growth space to reduce debt levels. And three, to allow for that kind of ability to shocks. When we talk about shocks, to also encourage building buffers, so when the next crisis hits, the budgets are in a better position. If you take the big lesson from this crisis, Sam, it is the same way like people with strong immune systems withstood COVID with more capacity to prevent terrible consequences. Economies with strong fundamentals were also better immune against the economic shock. And that is why ultimately we need rules that are supportive of these strong fundamentals, that are easy to enforce, and that are providing the capacity of the European Union to be a learning, as it has been so far, a learning system.
Thank you. Commissioner, the Next Generation EU element of this discussion, there's a big question about that, because obviously it's designed in its essence to be a time-limited initiative. That was part of the deal that was set in July last year. And yet the challenges we're talking about will not suddenly elapse or melt away in 2026-27. What's your preference? I realize you have to remain committed to the idea that it's temporary, but are there elements of the Next Generation EU framework structure that you think could be preserved in the longer term? Could this be kept somehow on the shelf as this option, for example? What future is there in terms of the EU's collective borrowing effort beyond the time frame of the Next Generation EU program?
There, in terms of our, let's say, continuing work on the stock exchanges, things will not go immediately in 26, because we have to carry over, we have to issuance and so on. So, I mean, in that respect, there is a kind of continuation, but indeed, I sense that there is a growing debate across Europe, in particular the financial market sector, that this could become something permanent. But as you rightly said, it's something which is a construction, also in terms of the legal provisions, in order to get it done. So this has to be respected. I think our priority now should be really to deliver, to demonstrate that exactly our aims, our goals, our targets are achieved finally, that we can really demonstrate the added value. And we should not forget, this was also mentioned by Kristalina, it's she was talking about buffer. I would stress the second part of the recovery plan, it's the resilience. And resilience means, in our understanding, to make the necessary reforms to create more resilience on our side in order to be better equipped for the next crisis whenever it comes and whatever are, so to say, the reasons for it. So it's also about preparing ourselves to weather down the next crisis, but also become more competitive on a global scale, because I think we have more potentials to become first movers in many areas than to be the first or second supplier. So we should use this crisis, as Churchill said, never miss a good crisis. We have now the opportunities, the financial ones. And if we are successful in doing all this, I think then we can reflect about the future. I leave it like this, because as I am always in favor to talk about the final structure of Europe, we should not talk already now, it's premature, about any the final structure of our financial opportunities. Also, this is a permanent work in progress. But again, the most important thing is that we deliver, that we show the European added value. And then I think we can even convince those who are more hesitant, because those who are more hesitant or reluctant, may I say so, the ones who are usually benefiting the most from the successful European single market. So talking about almost frugals, they are much more benefiting from a well-functioning single market than other players. If we demonstrate again the added value, they will see that they have a good return of their investments, and then let's see what next.
I'm going to open it up to questions shortly. Just before I do, Managing Director, what's your IMF like to see? Would the IMF like to see Next Generation EU morph into something more permanent, or would you be happy to see the budget shrink back to its previous rough size as a share of GNI in 2027 without this really being replaced by anything new?
It is important to see how Next Generation EU is going to perform. My expectation is it would play a significant role in redirecting the EU economy to low carbon, climate resilient, digital, and more inclusive. If it's an instrument that achieves that objective, it would be then evaluated on the results. And at that time, it would be important to recognize that perhaps there is space for an instrument like this on a more permanent basis. Obviously, we have to see the impact. My expectation, very much like Johannes, is that it would play a significant role to not only help the recovery, but to do the most important thing in this recovery, structural transformation. And if so, on that basis, it would be a good moment to think about the future of fiscal capacity at European Union level. If you could add one point, Sam, we do need to recognize that policymakers this year, next year, the year after, are going to be faced with the most complex and consequential policy choices in decades. Not only they marshal a more inclusive recovery to prevent build-up of inequalities that can undermine social cohesion, but they also, at the same time, have to support transformative policies towards the economy of the future. And the trade-offs that we have to make are so significant that, in my view, the EU working together, having both the coordination mechanisms of the councils, various councils, but also the capacity at EU level to make this turn, to support this turn, is going to be absolutely fundamental. And I am a big believer that the EU can come out of this crisis as a competitive leader in the areas that would matter the most for the future of the world, especially in the fight against climate change. So do it with all you have, and maybe Next Generation EU instrument is one thing that would help EU in that regard.
Thank you. So let me open it first of all to the audience here in the room with us today in Brussels. If you want to ask a question, please raise your hand. Make it, please, if you could, brief, just a question rather than a statement. And remember to press the button in front of you when you want to speak. And I can take a couple of questions now. And then we also have an audience online who've been sending things in, so we can bring some of those into the debate as well. First of all, over to you here. Very shy audience so far.
Sam, ask for the second question.
Okay. So also take online questions as well. Beatrice, if you have any so far?
Yes, we do. We have a question actually for the Managing Director. From your perspective, in which way do you think that the EU budget can contribute to foster the role of the EU as a global actor?
The EU budget has tremendous power to guide the European Union as a whole, as a collective, in terms of the leadership the EU exercises on the global scene. And there are three areas where I see tremendous role for the EU budget to guide the member states. The first, unquestionably, is on climate. As we are discussing the EU budget, the COP26 is in progress, there is no question that the European Union played an important role in mobilizing the world in the fight against climate change. The EU is the most determined in setting up targets for the mid-century, but most importantly, most determined in what ought to be done in this decade, the most critical decade for the future of our planet. And demonstrably directing funds towards the fight against climate change, and also grabbing the opportunity of a transition to the new climate economy. The EU budget, again, together with the member states, is playing a very important role. Secondly, in making sure that we can carry the whole world in this transformation. The EU is concentrating significant, massive support to help developing countries make this turn that they have the capacity to also transform. And of course, as we know, and I was very proud to be humanitarian commissioner in being out there to help the most vulnerable people, which takes me to my third point, which is the most relevant today. What the EU budget has done to help vaccinate the world, to lead towards making vaccinations available and affordable to countries that do not have the means to secure them for their own people. And I believe that if anything, the EU budget should take pride even more for that leadership that it has been playing in this crisis and to build resilience to crises to come.
Here. We have more questions coming from the audience. The last one we're here would like the floor. Okay, so if something like NextGenEU would be permanent, will also involve green bonds.
Commissioner, I think that's one for you.
Well, I think already today the issuance of green bonds is a success story, and of course what we are doing here is creating or contributing a huge global green bond market, also with different means, and it's not only us, it's also our member states, but we will certainly, when we have concluded our work, issued more than 250 billions as green bonds, and this will, as of today, at least double the current green bond global market. So this is one element. But I wanted to use the opportunity to talk about NextGenEU and what could be next, etc. I think we should keep in mind that the European budget, which was previously around 1% of the European GNI, is now maybe 2%, is nevertheless, so to say, the pooling factor for implementing political priorities across Europe. So we are spearheading political priorities, and the necessary economic and investments with a rather small budget compared to the overall budget of our member states. So this is a lesson we all, the Europeans, should learn, to pool a significant amount of financial resources at the European level in order to allow, so to say, the further development of Europe where necessary to address the necessary transitions. Today it's about climate change. In 10 years it might something different. Also all our investments and research, innovation, artificial intelligence, etc., is only finally achievable if we, so to say, gather all our means, put them together, pledge it, if you like, in order to achieve something in the long perspective. And so I think this is something people should keep in mind if it's called NextGenEU 2.0 or whatsoever. Important is to understand the European budget is always the one who is leading political developments across Europe, even if the share small one on the overall one.
Could I just, on just going back to you, Managing Director, on one thing you were talking about just now, is the issue of vaccines. Not a direct budget question, but it's still an important point in terms of the EU's role on vaccinating the world. The area of donations has been much, much slower in terms of EU member state donations and EU donations overall to lower income countries, and COVAX has really struggled to get off the ground. I wondered what your assessment is of the state of play, why, and what you want to see in terms of actually accelerating that process, because it has been notably slow.
There is no question that vaccinations are critical not only to prevent loss of life and suffering, but also for global economic recovery. We have been very clear from the fund. There are three priorities for the time ahead of us: vaccinate, calibrate, accelerate. And calibrate and accelerate would be on very soft footing if we don't vaccinate the world. We have put forward a plan, 50 billion, to achieve that. And I'm very pleased that the World Bank, WHO, and WTO endorsed this plan. We are now working collectively to press for accelerated donations and think where we are still short. On donations, we finally have created a tracker that shows how speedily they are being made, and that hopefully would help also European governments that have made pledges to recognize that it is not only the size of the pledge, but the timing of delivery that matters. We are advocating for swapping delivery dates. So if a European country has enough vaccines in November and is expecting a delivery in November, please swap this delivery date for February or March or April with delivering for the developing world. And we are also very strongly advocating a bit more generosity. We are still just over $20 billion short, able to meet two critically important targets: vaccinate at least 40% of populations of countries by the end of this year. We are making progress. Pressure helps, but we are not there. And vaccinate 70% by mid-next year, so we can rely on 2022 to be indeed the year of full recovery from this crisis.
I think it's, I have to admit, of course, everything could be faster and should be faster. But nevertheless, I'd like to stress or to recall that Europe so far has delivered more than 1 billion vaccines outside Europe, and we have provided around 900 million for our citizens inside Europe.
Yeah. This is very true,
we
Johannes.
have delivered
Yes.
more, and this is something I'm really proud. Of course, what could be, should be done, I fully agree, because it's a pandemia, and pandemia per definition means it's the whole world. So if we want really to extinguish it, we have to vaccine all people around the globe, ideally, and more has to be done, but also by others. And on top, whatever we have provided was without any strings attached and any conditions, different to others who clearly used it also as a so-called diplomatic tool to achieve something else. So here also Europe has respected its own values and convictions.
I very much agree with that. It is a matter of urgency, though. All commitments made are fulfilled on a time schedule that would make us meet these targets. And yes, Europe can lead in that regard.
I'm conscious there's an elephant in the room when it comes to NextGenEU, which is two of the plans have not yet been approved and been sitting on the shelf or unapproved for both the Polish and Hungarian plan. I do want to get a question into you, Commissioner, on the state of play. How soon do you think those two could be approved? Do you think that it's possible we could see those approvals by the Commission this month? And specifically on Poland, what do you see as the minimum conditions that need to be incorporated when it comes to rule of law and judicial independence in order for approval to be given?
Well, I have to admit I'm not directly involved in the negotiations on this matter, but I understand that it's now up to the two countries, but it's not only the two countries where we have still not finalized negotiations, but everybody's talking about the two. I hope this can be done soon, but of course some issues have to be resolved, and this issue are mainly resorting to the issues of rule of law. And there we need some clarifications, in particular concerning Poland, for instance, the most recent judgment of the National Constitutional Court, because it could have indeed an impact on the, let's say, independence of the judiciary when it comes to use European money, and this is definitely an issue which has to be sorted out. This is why we will very soon submit letters to ask for some clarifications.
Time for one more question from the online audience.
We have many questions coming from the audience. I'm going to try to put them all together because they're somehow linked. So there are a few questions about the future of the Next Generation EU. So on the one hand, how do we see the advantages of the disadvantages of linking the EU budget to the country-specific recommendations, and whether this could eventually replace Next Generation EU once the program is over? But there's a lot of questions about the future indeed. There are questions about what could be next for the MFF in 15, 20 years. What is it that should change in the EU budget, and main challenges ahead in terms of the implementation of the existing programs as well, and how might be like the cooperation with government I've seen in some issues that can be a little bit problematic. So maybe a chance to wrap up together for both the speakers.
Okay, I'll turn that to Managing Director, and we have a very limited, unfortunately, time left, so that's a very broad question.
Yes,
in
indeed.
a fairly short period of time.
What is the EU budget? It is part of the best invention of the 20th century, the convergence engine of the European Union. So as we go forward, it is important that this convergent engine continues to function in a changing world. We see it now with the redirection of funds to climate change. I expect to see the future of the budget to be about that, making sure the European Union functions at the level of the best performing countries, that it is lifting up the whole Europe, and that it is building resilience and agility for a world of change. How is it for short?
Very succinct.
Well, first I would like to recall that, and this is another element where I'm pretty proud about it, less than 7% of our budget is only used for the so-called overhead costs, for personnel and other overhead costs. And this is not only for the European Commission, but for all European institutions. It means in return, almost 93% of our budget is really spent for concrete actions. And out of this, around 80% more or less spent by member states in accordance with our general goals. So again, the budget structure is a structure which gives the member states, institutions, business sectors a lot of, so to say, reassurance what is available for around 7 years. And this is indeed, so to say, the reason why, again, we have this finally modest budget is nevertheless triggering a lot of political investments, which we consider altogether as relevant, important, as imminent. And I think this will stay for the future. What I expect is, if we're talking about 10, 15 years, that the composition of the budget might change to a certain extent, for instance, about new own resources, etc. But this is also something in particular requested and demanded by the European Parliament, but also by others. So I see some evolutions in the aspect of the composition. I think the general aim of the budget should retain to pursue certain political priorities. We don't know what are the priorities in 10 years, but the concept as such is okay, and it should be also by those who are skeptical to provide financial support to the European level, believing that this is a loss of sovereignty. It's a gain of sovereignty because they are using the European leverage to invest in the security, in the prosperity of their countries, of their citizens, of their people, and of their generations.
Budget then, as you say, in grand scheme of things, relatively small as a share of EU GDP, but an awful lot riding on it in terms of the future of the European project, especially this new Next Generation EU program, on which so much evidence is now, so much attention is now being paid. Thank you very much indeed, Managing Director, for joining us from Washington. Thank you, Commissioner, very much indeed for your time as well. And now back to Beatrice.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Now, indeed, sorry. We continue with our conference today. We're very much approaching the end, but we have a very special guest now, someone who was very much involved in shaping the budget and the Next Generation EU as the